I think that now would be a good time to dissect the work of art plan that Eric is referring to and all the pieces that had to fall into place for it to happen. Okay, here we go. Hogan and Bischoff come into the company on January 4th as faces. Jarrett was gonna be a heel, but that didn't work, so he's instead a face, meaning that Bischoff was a face at all times except for when he's around either Jeff Jarrett or Mick Foley. Meanwhile, Ric Flair stumbles into TNA, and while he's ambiguous at first, it soon becomes clear that he's actually a heel and has his sights set on TNA champion AJ Styles. Sean Waltman and Scott Hall continually sneak their way into the Impact Zone so that they can reform the band with Kevin Nash. They offer Hulk Hogan a place in the band, but he declines. Up in the rafters, Sting does his best Batman impression and broods for the next few months. While this is all going on, TNA reenacts the Montreal Screwjob with Styles in place of Michaels, Angle in place of Hart, and Hogan in place of McMahon. This goes nowhere. AJ falls under the influence of Flair and becomes a heel, leading to a match between him and Samoa Joe with Eric Bischoff as special guest referee, who is, Eric. Shortly after, Joe is kidnapped by ninjas and panel vans. This also goes nowhere. In response to Flair's grooming of AJ Styles, Hogan takes on his own protege in Abyss, who he gives the Hall of Fame ring and related superpowers. Whatever. And founds Abyssamania. This leads to an all-out blood feud between Hogan and Flair, shoving the actual talent to the back and making Abyss and Styles look like a couple of kids who can't understand why mommy and daddy won't stop fighting. Returning to the band, Nash took a face turn on Waltman and Hall and decided with Eric Young, only to swerve once again on Young and side with the band 2 weeks later. This leads to Young taking his own heel turn shortly after that on Team 3D and joining the band. This all, however, amounts to absolutely nothing as Hall gets fired for being, well, Scott Hall. The whole band storyline gets dropped, and Nash turns his sight on Hogan and Bischoff, who he blames for this turn of events. Sting, meanwhile, starts ranting and raving about how Hogan and Bischoff are going to screw over TNA, acting out violently and attacking Dixie Carter. Inexplicably, he isn't fired. Remember that, it becomes important later. Rob Van Dam eventually debuts on Impact, signed by, who else, Hogan and Bischoff. He feuds with Sting and soon becomes TNA champion on an episode of Impact. Elsewhere, Bischoff and Hogan also signed Jeff Hardy into the roster. TNA begins instituting a championship ranking system, and Sting is named #1 contender. Remember that, as it also becomes important. A couple of months go by, and somewhere in that period of time, Hogan and Bischoff form a secret cabal made up of them, Abyss, Hardy, Jarrett, and Flair's newly formed team, Fortune, to enact the Plan. But this raises a few questions, and I'll answer them here. 1. What made Flair and Hogan give up their blood feud that they nearly killed each other over and decide to work together? Well, that's not actually explained. 2. What is the goal of the Plan? Well, that's to make one of their boys TNA champion and to take over the company.
Of course!
Remember that because it becomes really important. And 3. Why did they do this in the first place? Well, according to Hogan, Dixie promised
to take all my ideas to take this company to the next level. But no, Eric, Dixie didn't want to do it the easy way.
Which is pretty damn stupid when you consider the fact that up until this point, Hogan and Bischoff have been allowed to book matches, sign talent, and imbue superpowers. How much more authority do you possibly need? Anyway, the plan begins with Abyss turning heel, attacking everything in sight, and spouting cryptic nonsense about they. The end result of this ploy is twofold. The first is that he would be so violent and destructive that Dixie would be forced to sign his termination papers, but she would be unwittingly signing the papers handing over the company to Eric Bischoff. But all of this was entirely unnecessary when you consider the fact that Sting was already doing the exact same thing, violently assaulting innocent people and spouting cryptic nonsense. Abyss never even needed to turn heel. They could have gone through with the Plan exactly as predicted, but with Sting in Abyss's position. But why should they even have termination papers involved? Why couldn't Eric have just slipped the contract into Dixie's day-to-day papers? But as I said, the reason for Abyss's face turn were twofold. The other reason was so that Abyss could nearly murder Rob Van Dam, forcing him to vacate the title so they could do away with the championship ranking system and make a tournament where Hardy would wind up the champion. But remember when I said that Sting was named #1 contender a while back? Doesn't it seem like behind closed doors ranking system is a perfect tool for a corrupt authority to position one of their guys in the main event? Instead of Sting, what if Bischoff had just flubbed the results and put Hardy in that position instead? This means that they could have accomplished their plan months ago. Hell, they kept on missing opportunities to enact their plan. Like at Victory Road, where it was a fatal four-way between Rob Van Dam, Mr. Anderson, Jeff Hardy, and Abyss. 2 out of those 4 wrestlers were one of their guys. That's better odds than they had at Bound for Glory. You'd think that that would have been the perfect time to strike, but no, they didn't. Instead, after Victory Road, Dixie signs EV 2.0 and rebooks Hard Justice on her own. Now you'd think that this action would be justifiable reason for Hogan and Bischoff to claim that they didn't have enough involvement. But since this happened long after the plan began, we can only assume the whole thing is just a pointless detour. Speaking of things that don't add up on the timeline, let's look at Sting. Sting started claiming that Hogan and Bischoff had turned heel long before the plan began, meaning that for months Sting actually was a raving conspiratorial lunatic. It's like time went backwards on this storyline. Instead of having it that Dixie brings in Evie 2.0, Hogan and Bischoff turn heel as a result, and Sting starts claiming conspiracy, they did it all backwards, meaning that none of it makes any damn sense. Anyway, after Hardcore Justice, they had the whole effing show, which had the main event of Abyss versus Rob Van Dam for the TNA Championship, with Eric Bischoff as guest referee. You'd think that if ever there was a time to make one of your buddies TNA champion, it'd be the time when you are the special guest referee. But of course, that isn't what they do, and Rob Van Dam retains the title. Meanwhile, Sting and Nash band together in their mutual disdain for Hulk Hogan and eventually involve the Pope. Jarrett comes to the defense of Hogan and somehow drags Samoa Joe into the situation. Apparently he escaped from the secret Panel Van Ninja lair off camera. This all leads us to Bound for Glory, where the plan is unveiled, everyone turns heel, and I'm left talking for the last 4 minutes about bullshit TNA continuity.